webinar. We appreciate you being here, and we know that all that's going on in your world, so we appreciate your time today. Just want to welcome you back, remind you that we are recording this. It'll be posted on our site tomorrow. And the Q&A will be the place that we take your questions. So what we'll ask you to do is post your questions in Q&A. We'll get to those at the very end. And again, for those of you just joining us, we do have one more moderator. We've got some technical glitches happening. So Chelsea will be joining us in just a moment. But I first want to thank Lozano Smith, our partner, CASBO partner, longtime partner, for shedding light on what has so little known aspects in this current environment. So we really appreciate you coming forward and sharing what we do know. I want to welcome today Ramon Muñoz, who's partner at Lozano Smith. And again, Chelsea Murphy will soon be joining us for her portion of the presentation. But with no further delay, I want to turn it over to you, Ramon. Thank you for being here and helping us with such a difficult and challenging topic today. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. We really appreciate the opportunity to present. This is one of those subjects that in the ever-evolving sort of adjustment school districts need to make in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today we're going to be reviewing the vaccine verification order, testing of unvaccinated workers, and really kind of get in sort of those practical issues that we're all going to be facing. Chelsea, you did great, you were able to get in. We're going to be also talking about record storage, negotiation impacts, and exemptions and protocols. And I do think, you know, Chelsea and I are both very focused on addressing those practical issues that come up and that you're all going to be facing. So, you know, feel free to ask us those questions, the ones that have been pressing before you, and we'll definitely give you the best answer we can, aside from the lawyerly maybe or possibly, or you could do that, right? So, Chelsea, do you want to go ahead and get started on the vaccination verification?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you for bearing with me as we were having some difficulties logging on here. So as you've all heard, we have the vaccine verification order for workers, and now we've got all of our LEAs that have to be in full compliance by October 15th, 2021. So I think everybody is working really hard on trying to come into compliance. What we've been seeing is a lot of issues surrounding, okay, so who does this order actually apply to? So it applies to all public and private schools serving TK through grade 12, but it does not apply to homeschool or childcare. And we've been getting a lot of questions around whether it applies to childcare, because how the order is written is it says that it applies to K through 12 facilities. And so, you know, a lot of our preschools, childcares, daycares are on those K through 12 facility sites. But I believe it was last week the state issued a couple of FAQs providing just a little bit of clarification. And they've now said that it does not apply to childcare regardless of this facility that it's on. So I don't know, how are you seeing clients implement that, Ramon?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that with districts with childcare programs, they're often on school sites. And I think you have a childcare, you know, classroom right next to a TK or K program. And, you know, most districts are saying, look, you're still an employee. We're going to put you in the testing or vaccination requirement, and just try and have the best approach for you know, across the board testing.
Yeah, I've been seeing that too, that they're saying, so even though this order doesn't directly apply to our partner agencies at our school sites, you know, we're still asking them to show verification or show proof that they are actually testing those employees. And so interestingly, the order applies to all workers, and they define that as all paid and unpaid adults serving in the school setting. So there was also a question, okay, so does this apply to our workers at the district office who don't actually ever go into the school setting? And that FAQ that I mentioned that came out last week, that also clarified, yes, it applies to all of those workers. And it also applies to any volunteers who are actually on our school site. So that was another question. So that's something that we really need to think through if our school sites are allowing, parent volunteers to come to the sites. I know my own kid's school is allowing 1 volunteer per class this year. And so all of those volunteers will also actually have to verify their vaccinations.
I think we're on slide 7, but if we could back up to slide 5, I do think that, it has, the quotes from the order that I think that we definitely want to make sure that everybody is aware of. So if possible, if we could back up to slide 5.
Michelle, there you go. Michelle, can you back up to slide 5, please?
Yep, there we go. All right. So as mentioned, as Chelsea mentioned, all paid and unpaid adults serving in the school settings. So as Chelsea mentioned, they have the states put together FAQs. We can use plural since there's 2 of them, right? There's 2 questions. But it kind of, leaves unresolved, I guess, this question about contractors, right? And Chelsea and I have had this conversation as to, when you think of contractors, one category is, construction companies working on a school site. Are we going to require that, that construction company and their subcontractors all provide, proof of vaccination or to be tested weekly? And I think that there's some practical considerations there, especially, one, are we saying that they are serving in the school settings? And I think you can make the argument that, yeah, they are. But practically speaking, I think, hey, are we in a position to say, well, construction company, unless you can provide for testing or vaccination status of all your workers and your subcontractors, then we're not doing this work. Any thoughts, Chelsea?
Yeah, we're seeing districts really take various approaches on this. Some are taking a really strict approach and saying basically, anyone who enters our school site has to comply with this order, be it, a volunteer, a preschool teacher, a contractor. We don't care what the order says. We're going to apply this across the board. And then there's others who are taking kind of a more practical approach, and they're saying, look, in our community, if we require this, then we're not going to have enough people showing up to build the things that we need to build, or we're not going to have, the daycare providers or the partner providers providing that childcare. So I think it really is a, district specific, place specific thing but it should be considered. I think it really needs to be thoughtfully considered as to, okay, who are all the people entering our school sites? Who are the people this order actually specifically applies to? And if the order doesn't apply to them, do we really want to require this across the board?
Definitely. All right. Now, maybe go to the next slide when we're looking at verifying vaccination status. So there are various categories on being able to verify vaccination status. There's six ways to do that. I will say the one way that is not there is a self-attestation. That was, very different than Cal OSHA's emergency temporary standards that they had put out, where, prior to this vaccination or testing requirement, Cal OSHA would say, hey, one way in which to, demonstrate, fully vaccinated status is to have a self-attestation. That is not applicable, or that does not qualify this time around.
Yeah, no, and I think that is really important because it's kind of like, it's a lot of whiplash because a lot of school districts were saying, okay, we can use this self-attestation method. It's been approved by Cal OSHA. And they had actually sent that all out and collected all that data so that the vaccinated workers wouldn't have to wear masks in certain situations, right? And so now we're saying, no, that self-attestation form isn't enough. What we actually need is, physical documentary proof showing that the employee has been vaccinated. So that could be the actual record of the card. It could be, you know, a picture of the card. We're having a lot of districts that are using kind of a form where they do complete the self-attestation and then they upload, you know, the employee then uploads a document like a picture or something along those lines so that the district can actually track it. But, you know, you could actually have an employee come to the office and physically show you their card and take that card with them, but then you're checking off a box in your own documentation to show that they've proven that. I think if we move on to the next slide, we'll see the last four or the last three methods that we have there. Yeah, and so interestingly, and this number 6 I wanted to point out, because one of the methods is documentation of vaccination from other contracted employers that follow these vaccination records guidelines. So that to me suggests that they do believe that some contractors should be following, you know, this guidance. And basically this would be the partner agency providing you with, hey, you know, we have checked all the vaccination verifications of our employees. And we verify that they're vaccinated or something along those lines, or we verify that our unvaccinated workers are being tested weekly. And I think this has been coming up. Sorry, go ahead, Ramon.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think definitely looking at that term contracted employees or employers is, you know, like, not that any district out there has a full arrangement of speech language pathologists or special education specialists. So, you know, definitely those areas, you know, I think where it starts going into the gray are things like we mentioned, or services like we mentioned, like the construction contractors that may be working on our sites. So go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good point in that first bullet. So the order specifically says that in the absence of knowledge to the contrary, a school may accept the documentation presented as valid. So that means, you know, that we don't have to go through looking to see whether somebody's submitting fake documentation. So long as it looks legitimate and we have no reason to doubt it, we can take that as legitimate. Now, I think that that is something that we have to keep watching, because we are seeing, you know, some of these false vaccination cards, and we are seeing some of them in school districts. So far, I've only seen them coming from students, but, you know, I imagine that we will see some from employees. So that's just something to keep in mind and to watch.
Yeah, Pfizer's not spelled with an F. Okay, so that's one indication, right? So be on the lookout for that, right?
Yeah, and then the other bullet point, and we're going to talk about the storage of these records in a little bit, but the order does directly require that schools have a plan in place for tracking verified worker vaccination status. So you've got to be able to track that and be able to provide that to local public health departments upon request. So you have to have it in some, you know, some form that allows you to share that pretty easily. All right, so let's move on.
So maybe we move on to, yeah, we'll move on to the testing of unvaccinated employees.
Yeah, so for those workers who are not fully vaccinated or who have refused to respond to your form to verify their vaccination status, so they're unknown, this order requires that all of those employees undergo weekly testing. We've gotten a lot of questions about what that weekly testing can look like. You know, what kind of tests should we be using? So you can specifically use any PCR or antigen tests. So the PCRs are generally those more invasive tests, and the antigen tests are usually those rapid tests. You just have to make sure that the tests that you're using have that EUA, that emergency use authorization. So I think, you know, if you're using the state testing, then all of those have been approved for that. But if you're ordering from some contracted company, there are, you know, some tests on the market that don't have that EUA approval. So you just want to make sure that they meet that requirement. So again, you know, just like vaccines, you have to have a plan in place for tracking these test results. And then once you receive them, you have to be able to conduct workplace contact tracing, which I know many of us are doing so much more contact tracing than we ever thought possible. I think, when I became a lawyer, I don't think I even knew what contact tracing was. And now it's something, that we all deal with on a daily basis. So that's part of the order as well. And then again, we have to be able to report the results to our public health departments. So Roman, have you seen any districts dealing with testing shortages at this point?
Yeah, there is information out there like indicating that there is a potential for a shortage of tests, and I think primarily those antigen tests that there's a rumor out there. I think more than a rumor that we may be encountering a testing shortage. That presents its whole different issue. I think that one thing that we've discussed, Chelsea, is, hey, if you at a district are getting indications that we may not have sufficient tests as we move into October, or concerns with supply chains, I do believe that, hey, contacting and reaching out and documenting our efforts to local public health and the state public health officer as to, hey, can we get some guidance as to what to do if we do run into testing shortages? And I think internally, we also have to think about, well, if we do find ourselves in a situation where we have a shortage of tests, what are we going to develop sort of a priority list for employees that will be tested weekly versus employees serving in other sort of positions and in other duties? Kind of just thinking of that sort of that approach where, hey, closest to the classroom, working with students and just sort of fanning out that way. That may be an approach that we do take.
Yeah, and the last I heard is,
oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, the last I heard is the state was saying that they do have adequate tests. And so if you haven't signed up for their testing services at this point, you can utilize that schools hub that CDPH has and, see all the different ways that you can get testing. Now, I have spoken to some districts that say, yes, they're signed up for every method of CDPH testing, and they are being a little bit crunched at this point. But just in case you haven't, I would recommend that you go there and sign up for those.
Yeah, and another strategy may be, between now and the 15th, see what you can do to, try and promote vaccinations, right? So if you have employees that are vaccinated, they don't have to submit to the weekly testing. That may be a strategy or an approach that people may want to take. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easier and more seamless that you can make vaccinations, I think it makes the job of testing a lot simpler, because then you're not dealing with, so many employees in line getting the tests, and having to come up with so many different tests. Now, what about substitutes and volunteers? Do we have to test them as well?
I believe so. I think substitutes, if they're not vaccinated, they will have to be tested. And then that becomes a question as to, okay, well then, when are we going to find time to have them tested? I do think that there's a couple strategies to take. One, I think the best case scenario is that, hey, you just have vaccinated substitutes. That would be the best case scenario. If not, and I want to be practical here. I understand that there is a severe substitute teacher shortage, and just saying, okay, every substitute, if you want to work here, you have to be vaccinated, may not be practical. It may not. In most situations, probably not. So, looking at weekly testing, any thoughts on sort of any approaches there, Chelsea?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what kind of tests you have and how many of them you have, because I think those rapid tests are pretty quick to administer. And so if you have an overabundance of them, if you're lucky and you ordered a ton, way back when, then you could have substitutes test, whenever they come in. Another way to do it is to tell employees that they have to test outside of the workday and that they have to show up with their proof whenever they test during a specific week. Now, I think that might have the same practical impact you were talking about of, limiting your subpool. I am seeing some school districts who are requiring vaccinations for their substitute teachers, even though they're not requiring them for the rest of their employees. But I think, again, this is really a case-by-case approach, and you have to think about, what impact it'll have on your substitute teacher pool and, whether you can shrink it at all, what your availability of those employees actually is.
Yeah, and I think when we look at testing, there's no requirement that, hey, they be on district property, when taking the test. There's at-home tests. We definitely do want to make sure, though, that, hey, there is that line of communication with the substitute as to making sure, hey, you are taking the test and you are making the results available to us. If we could back up, though, I think that third bullet point from the bottom, there is, I'm sorry, it's still on that slide, but there is that statement, we must report results to local public health departments. Chelsea, I think you've had some conversations with local public health officials and what their expectations are.
Yeah, and I think that really shifts from county to county. So I would recommend,
sure. Yeah.
Contacting your local public health. I think everybody has a liaison probably at this point that you can work with, because I think in some cases, they don't want all of your results every week, right? But they do for sure want to know your positive results so that they can, in some cases assist you and guide you in contact tracing, and just because they're tracking those results. So I know that some public health offices now just have, a button and a link on their websites that will allow you to upload those results. So I really recommend, working with your liaison to figure out exactly what they're expecting from you and figuring out the best format to allow for that two-way communication.
Yeah, I think it's very important not to assume that they only want positive, test results. I do think it's important to make sure we know that up front of what their expectations are. So. I think if we
that
go
leads us
to slide 11.
to that next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is a really tough one because, all of this vaccination and these testing records, these are all considered confidential medical records, right? And so legally, we know we're required to store those, privately and separately, confidentially from every other type of employment record. But at the same time, the order gives us these, tracking requirements. So I've really seen a lot of districts kind of struggling to put this into place. Have you seen that, Roman?
Oh, yeah. I think that definitely trying to maintain this information, keep it confidential, keep it up to date is challenging. There are, I believe, various, personnel, sort of human resources, sort of computer programs that are trying to adjust to this and to provide services to be able to help track this information. So you may want to, reach out to a vendor or maybe even create your own, right? But I do think that is an important component of this. One, make sure that we're tracking this and make sure that we have keep this information confidential, since it is, important and it must be kept confidential.
Yeah, and I would love it if we could give you the magic bullet of this is the software that really works, and we could promote that. But I've been doing an informal survey for the past couple of weeks with pretty much every group that I talk to, and I haven't found anyone that's found a method that they think works really well at both, protecting employee confidentiality while at the same time being able to, share and track and share these results. So, I think everybody is kind of working on some Band-Aid fixes right now. and they're just working in the confidential areas of their specific programs that they use for every other type of human resource issue, and kind of working out from there. But I think it is really helpful. And I know that, there's a lot of folks on this group who are working on this. So if I would recommend some sharing between everyone, if there's programs that you think are really successful. I've known one group who is really a high level ARIES users, and they've been able to figure out how to use that program to do some test tracking. I'm unclear as to whether that was just for students, but it might be a way to use it because they have, really good confidentiality there. I know some districts who are really, they're basically Google districts, are using, their Google Workforce software in order to do that as well.
And
so I think it's just, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just to also say, though, when it comes to the testing component of this, I think some of the information or experiences that we've had, in the past 18, 19 months really do come in to help us as we move forward to this next stage. I mean, one primarily is, undoubtedly making sure, hey, whatever test that you do have or any vendor that you do use, that they do have a component to make sure that you as the employer have access to the test results. I know that was sort of a hiccup that various local educational agencies, encountered right at the beginning of the testing, component. Make sure that, hey, you get those test results right away. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to rely on employees giving you that update. And anytime that occurs, there's always the possibility of someone refusing or definitely human error not giving you that information when you need it. So.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point. So if you are entering agreements with vendors regarding the testing, make sure that that is a component of the agreement, that they will provide you with the testing results. Because I saw the exact same thing where they said, oh no, this is confidential medical information, you can't have it. Luckily, in those cases, often we had it in the agreement that said we need to have this information. So then you can point to that, and then they'll share it with you.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Should move on to potential negotiations issues.
Let's do it.
All right. So recently, there's been the Public Employment Relations Board has issued decisions basically saying, hey, when an employer can go ahead and implement a mandatory, testing vaccination requirement, and that is not subject to negotiation. That's a managerial prerogative, given the situation that we're in. Now, that decision also said, though, that we are required to negotiate impacts of any type of decision for mandatory testing or vaccination requirements. So the first thing that you want to do is really sort of look at, okay, well, in each individual district, county office of education, hey, is this changing any working conditions that are within the scope of bargaining? So is our plan, how we're going to do this, is it going to impact, wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment, right? And if it is, do we have a current agreement that addresses, say, testing or vaccination status? We may even have a past practice, but I would be very cautious of saying, hey, any mandatory vaccination or mandatory testing requirement is subject to a past practice, right? I mean, that's because this is so specific. I do think once we get this started, and if you haven't already, at least provide some sort of written notice to our labor partners. It can be, it's required under the law. Government Code Section 3543.2 says we need to provide reasonable written notice of a decision that could impact an item within the scope of bargaining. I think it's just as straightforward as saying we are going to follow, the public health order that's requiring mandatory vaccination or testing of school personnel please let us know if you'd like to discuss this and give a date that you would want to receive a response by. I think it's so important not to say, hey, do you want to negotiate this? Hey, do you want to discuss it? Leave it open-ended that way and really put in there a date because otherwise, hey, if it's so open-ended, you may get a demand to bargain on October 16th. And, that's a lot of fun right there. Chelsea, any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, so what if we're at the table, we've done what you said, but we can't really reach any agreement on the impacts. I want to test outside. I want employees to test outside of work hours. They're demanding that they get paid to be tested. We're just not going anywhere. Like, what do we do then?
Yeah, so I mean, the way the precedent is under the Public Employment Relations Board, when they've interpreted the duty to bargain in good faith, when we have a deadline like October 15th to come into compliance with this, the Public Employment Relations Board has said, look, if you've given your labor partner, a notice and opportunity to negotiate, but you have a deadline, right, or an important managerial interest, you can go ahead and implement that quote unquote change in working conditions, and those subjects that are impacted, prior to reaching final agreement, if you've negotiated prior to and you have a commitment to negotiate in good faith as we go along. So I do think we definitely should have that sort of, I guess, knowledge and, for lack of a better term, leverage going into negotiations with our labor partners, saying, hey, look, we're here to negotiate with you in good faith, but if we can't reach an agreement by October 15th, we still have to go forward with our vaccination and testing process. And this is how we'd want to lay that out. Chelsea, thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say, some of the in these impacts negotiations, we can kind of incentivize vaccines and things like that because, in some of these agreements, we're seeing districts offer, a certain amount of paid time for employees to go get those vaccines. And then maybe they'll say, we'll give you paid time to get the vaccines, but we're not going to pay you to go get the testing because we see this more as like a compliance issue. We see this more like tuberculosis testing or fingerprinting or something like that. This is a term and condition of your job. So I think that even in these impacts negotiations, you can really think about, what do we want to prioritize? And if vaccines are something we want to prioritize, then you can use this as a method for doing that. But what we're seeing really in these impacts are, when, how, where the tests are conducted. And then these folks who don't want to get vaccinated, they oftentimes also don't want to get tested as well. So, we're seeing some negotiations on what do we do if you don't show up for testing? And Ramon, you've negotiated some of those agreements, right?
Yeah, part of this is the non-compliance that you have to plan for. I do think that there's a difference between outright refusal to test if an employee can't provide proof of vaccination versus someone who may have missed the test. And I do think you start from the perspective of progressive discipline. If someone misses, hey, maybe some counseling, maybe a discussion, maybe a letter of warning, and really trying to find out, as I know we're going to be talking exemptions later on, but does this individual qualify for an exemption? And if they did, why did they wait so long to tell us that they qualify for an exemption, right? That's going to be a question. But I do think sort of taking that approach as to engaging with the employee, finding out, do they have an excuse, defense, or justification or exemption as to why they shouldn't have to test, work through those issues as we'll discuss, but then also looking at from the lens of, hey, is this someone who needs to be accommodated? And if not, then do we have to go ahead and take disciplinary action? And what does that look like? So,
right, and I think these agreements are kind of an opportunity to say what that looks like. We can use them as sort of some expedited discipline or a way of saying, like, if you miss 2 tests without an excuse, then you can't return to the classroom and we're not going to keep paying you, right? And so we're seeing some of these agreements show that process. So this is just another opportunity to think about if, they're demanding to negotiate, what are things that would be helpful on the district side as well.
And I'll say this before we leave this slide. I know that, quarantine and use of sick leave has been a big issue. I haven't seen anything specific as to an extension of SB 95, the supplemental paid sick leave. Chelsea, have you seen any legislation extending that?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen that request floating around quite a bit from some associations, but I don't believe that I've seen anybody that has agreed to extend that SB 95 quarantine leave at this point.
Yeah. Well, and I don't see the legislature actually any pending legislation right now, and they've got till, tomorrow, right, to put
yeah,
that
so
together.
that means that employees who are on this quarantine, after I think, the end of September, will have to just utilize their sick leave. Now, if they're out of sick leave, the Cal OSHA regs do require that they continue on paid status where they're on a quarantine when they were exposed in the workplace. That's a little outside of this presentation, but I think that's important to keep in mind as well as this SB 95 leave starts to expire. Should we move on to the exemption?
Maybe, I think that's going to be, probably practically one of the biggest challenges, districts and county offices of education face, right? The medical and religious exemptions that are coming forward.
Yeah, we started with all these notes saying that folks couldn't wear masks, right? And now I think we're moving into the world of, now we're seeing notes that say employees can't get vaccinated or employees can't be subject to testing. So, how do we handle that when we have an employee that submits a doctor's note and just says exempt from vaccinations and testing?
Right.
So I think it's complicated, right?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think the best thing that we can do, especially in these very, unforeseen times, is really rely back on the processes that we have in place. Each district should have a reasonable accommodation process to engage in the interactive process, to determine, what an employee's limitations are. Why can't they, submit to testing if they're not going to provide proof of vaccination? And just really work with the employee on, identifying, those limitations that they're saying, those medical limitations that prevent the employee from participating in testing. And Chelsea, I think you've encountered a situation where, that an employee actually did provide some proof that they couldn't submit to nasal swab testing, correct?
Yes, they had a nasal condition that would not allow them to be subject to the nasal PCR testing. But, what we said is, hey, we can have an alternative to that because, we did have the oral swab testing. So I think Roman made a really good point as to, stepping back from the note that just says, no, the employee can't do this, and stepping back into our process. So is this an individual with a disability, that is entitled to a reasonable accommodation, and engaging them in the interactive process. So we say, okay, so we ask the doctor, usually we say, okay, this note isn't really good enough. We need some more information. So we send them with a medical questionnaire to the doctor and we say, what are this employee's limitations? And then once we receive what their actual limitations are, then we can determine whether or not there are any reasonable accommodations that will help them perform the essential functions of their job. And I will say, so other than that nasal swab one, I haven't really seen an employee who can, neither be vaccinated nor be tested. Have you run across that yet, Roman?
I haven't, not for a medical exemption. I really haven't. I do think, though, that if it becomes sort of, for a lack of a better term, sort of a personal preference for under the medical exemption, if an employee says, hey, I just refuse to be vaccinated or tested, then you still go through this process to try and find a reasonable accommodation. You do make, an offer to the employee. And I would even suggest that, you make that offer in writing to the employee, how you're prepared to offer a reasonable accommodation given the information that you've been provided, and really leave it to the employee to affirmatively, say, I'll accept it or I reject it. Now, if the employee rejects, the testing requirement, right? What would be the accommodation that we would then have to rely upon? Any thoughts, Chelsea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. So in your scenario, is it a person who has a disability and a restriction, or are they just refusing to test?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, given the testing options available, a saliva test, the nasal swab test, how are we going to comply with this state order, an employee not submitting to a test, for medical reasons? I don't see a way in which we can say, oh well, you don't have to take the test. I haven't encountered that where it's like clear across the board that this person should not have to take a test. I do think at that point in time we start thinking, hey, is this an opportunity to suggest that this person take an unpaid leave of absence? Is this a situation where we need to start talking about progressive discipline, or some sort of counseling with this employee as to this is what we're going to be seeing down the road if you refuse to test, and what it could lead to. Any other thoughts on accommodations?
Yeah, well, so I think if the employee is just, flat out refusing, I'm not going to comply with this order, I think this order is stupid, it's not based on science, all those sorts of things, then I think we're really talking about that progressive discipline route, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I
Yeah.
think if there is a restriction, then we're really talking about that reasonable accommodation route. And I actually was just thinking, I did deal with one where an employee was allergic to one of the ingredients in one of the vaccines that came out early on, right? And so submitted a doctor's note saying that they couldn't get it. But then when we questioned the doctor a little bit further, we found out that they could use a different vaccine because it didn't rely on those same ingredients. So I think it's really working through that process and not just accepting, one of these notes at face value. It's just remembering that we have the process and remembering to walk all the way through it. So I think that's all on medical exceptions. I think we also now are starting to see a lot of religious exemption requests. Have you been seeing those, Ramon?
I've been seeing a number of those, and it's almost a form letter, because I've seen it in different parts of the state, the same information, basically the same font, where it comes with two statements. One, it's a religious exemption based on the fact that a sincerely held belief that this individual holds that they should not be taking in or have administered a vaccine that is against their religious beliefs. And then number two, the fact that, hey, they do not want to be subjected, they do want to be subjected to testing because their religious beliefs or their sincerely held belief is the fact that they should not have any foreign object inserted into them. So that's the type of letter or exemption you're going to likely receive from an employee that is claiming a religious exemption. Now, the definition of a religious, a religious belief is a sincerely held belief, right? I mean, there's really, I guess, no way to disprove, hey, well, we don't believe that you have that religious belief. I don't think you even want to go there. I do think it's, all right, put down your religious belief in writing, which this form letter has, and then you start from the same sort of interactive process that you did with the medical exemptions, right, Chelsea?
I think that's exactly right. So a lot of times we want to get caught up and we say, we don't believe that this is a sincerely held religious belief, right? They just came up with this yesterday. They didn't believe this last weekend. But I think that Ramon's exactly right. We don't want to challenge someone's sincerely held religious belief. However, we can require them to still participate in all of these things if it's going to create an undue hardship on the district. And I really think that this does create an undue hardship. And now the undue hardship here is different than in the medical and the reasonable accommodation process. Really, it's just more than a de minimis impact. And that's a lawyerly term, but it's more than just a little impact on the district. So this really isn't a huge standard. So if it's having an impact on the district for them not to, get vaccinated or to get tested, then we can say, it's an undue hardship and the district can't accommodate that. But I think the key is that we do need to go through, and I hesitate to call it an interactive dialogue, but it's sort of like an interactive dialogue light, right? Like we need to walk through to make sure that they have a sincerely held religious belief. What is the accommodation they're requesting? And is that having an undue hardship on the district? And I think we want to make sure that we document that process in writing, and then we let them know, we understand your sincerely held religious belief. However, you will still be required to participate in this program because it does cause an undue hardship on the district.
Yeah, and I think that's so important to document those efforts, because the situations that we've seen that have been reported when it comes to vaccination and testing, where other industries have faced challenges, is where the employee all of a sudden says, "Well, no, I'll submit to testing now, or I'll get vaccinated now," after the employer has taken whatever type of action or sort of response. So I think it's really important to get that confirmed, that the employee is either refusing to submit to any testing, and why so, and to address that, because otherwise that employee could just simply come back and say, "Well, no, I'll submit to a saliva test versus a nasal swab." So those are those types of things that you really want to watch out for and make sure that you have it confirmed.
Well, I think that, first of all, thank you. My goodness, what a great amount of information. I think that brings us to questions. We have a lot of them. As folks know, we were late getting started just with a technical difficulty. So we are recording the session. We will be posting it on the website. So if you need to jump off for another call, please know that this will be recorded, and any additional resources will be provided on the site. But I'm going to jump right in. We do have a lot of questions. All the way back to the top of the presentation where we're talking about vaccine verification. Are board members included in that?
We won't all jump in at once, right? I think that we're seeing some different approaches on that. I think that our general advice is that board members are not considered workers at school sites. However, they may be, they may be volunteers. Like if they're regularly entering a K through 12 school site when kids are present, then I think that we can hold them to that standard. I don't know, Roman, do you have different thoughts?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, board members per se aren't employees, right? They are elected officials. Now there'll be employees for things like workers' comp or your general comprehensive general liability policies, but quote unquote, they don't meet the definition of employees or workers under this order. I would say though that this is where leadership counts, and if our elected officials, we definitely want to put them on notice that, hey, if we're going to take disciplinary action against an employee that is not vaccinated and will not submit to testing, undoubtedly we're going to get a question from our labor partners or an attorney representing an employee going like, okay, well, you're going to impose this, but your own board members aren't following it, right? So I do think it's something that board members should consider. In a perfect world, yeah, they would participate either in providing proof of vaccination or submit to weekly testing.
Thank you. And we're going to move quickly. We've got 42 questions. I know we're not going to get to all of them, but we are going to go over just because we got a little late start there.
Sure.
We're still on that vaccination. If the order does not include childcare preschool, how can we mandate that those workers participate in vax or tests?
Yeah, most of the time those employees are part of bargaining units, and I do think that the impacts bargaining will often involve, hey, who is going to be tested, and what our expectations are, and I think including those child care workers in that group is the best route to go. I don't think we're going to have a lot of resistance from our labor partners on this, because I do believe that this was this order was motivated in part by the influence that groups like CTA and CSEA have. So my experience has been that they've been more than willing to have child care workers included in the testing requirement. I don't know, Chelsea, you have any sort of
yeah, well,
experiences
like with
that?
our YMCA partners and those other folks who are using district facilities, we're finding that we're just, we're reaching out and saying, we've got this order, it applies across our campuses, we're going to enforce this against your agency as well. Let us know how we can work this out. And then we're either updating the agreement, doing an addendum, or they're just providing documentation showing that their workers have complied with the order.
Thank you. We just need a quick confirmation that regarding acceptable documentation, we cannot accept a self-attestment attestation of vaccination, right? We need to have documented proof. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And there's those 6 methods of vaccination verification in the order.
Thank you. If a parent requests to have a private assessor, evaluator, special ed, IEE, observe the student in the classroom, does this individual need to provide proof of vaccination in order to come to the school site?
I haven't looked at this closely, but my first inclination would be yes, because they are a person coming onto the school site and interacting directly with students in the classroom. You might want to consult with your special education attorney, but that's what my gut would say.
Thank you.
I think the order is broad enough to say, like, hey, look, if you want to come onto our campus, perform a service, and get paid for it, then yeah, you have to show proof.
For contractors, do we need an actual copy of the proof or CVRC, or can they just show proof?
It doesn't say that you need an actual copy of it. It just says documentation, and I'm just trying to pull it up, documentation of vaccination from other contractor employers. So I think that you could have the contractor verify that they have actually looked at the card or whatever those methods are, but you wouldn't have to look at it yourself because you're not their employer, if that makes sense.
We're still on that topic of the proof. Does this apply to student teachers on site to collect from the universities as well?
I believe it would. I think that order is broad enough. I think the term is, hey, you're coming onto a site, and you're supporting school functions. So I think those student teachers, I think they would.
Yeah, and I think
have to. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I completely agree with you.
No,
I think you want to work it out with the university as to whether you will be collecting the documentation of the student teacher or whether they're just going to verify it and give you documentation of that. I think it could work either way.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Roman, I know you gave us the tip on Pfizer not spelled with an F. Is there any other guidance on spotting a fake vaccination card? And I'll just combine this with if you have a sample of, kind of how folks are attesting to this, if you could share that. But we'll start with spotting a fake vaccination card.
Yeah, I think looking at the very information on there, sort of the dates, seeing if there is anything very suspicious about the signatures on the actual cards. And I'm a true believer, if anything's written in crayon, we probably want to get verification on that. But no, I just play. But no, I think especially if you get the physical card, you want to make sure that it's of the same sort of texture and quality of other cards that you've seen. If there's any indication of that, hey, it's a cheap knockoff copy or something like that, you definitely want to be alertive on that. I also do think one thing that hasn't come up yet, but if there's a doctor's name on it, we always could call and confirm, right? Like we do with just regular notes. Any thoughts, Chelsea, on that piece?
Yeah, the other thing I think you could do, if you have a big concern and there's a lot of employees that we think are submitting fake cards, that number 5 allows you to do the digital record that includes the QR code. And so I think that will access you to the state database that would verify they've actually received it. So I think if you have a big problem, then you could just require everyone to utilize number 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Maricela, we will be posting a template that some of our districts have shared in terms of tracking the vaccination status. So we'll put that in our resources with this as well. We've talked about an employee refusing to submit already. We have a question. Riverside County Public Health is telling us home testing is no longer valid. Is that your understanding?
So I have heard that from a couple of health departments. So I think it just depends on where you are. And I think there's been some concerns with the big delays in receiving the results and things along those lines. I think the gold standard is to be able to do it in the workplace with the employer getting the results right there. But if you can't do that, then I think you need to work with your local public health as to how else we can meet these requirements.
Thank you.
And I also think, I think maybe even to clarify that though would be, hey, are they saying like an employer issued test that allowed an employee to take the testing kit home and administer the test and submit it? Is that no longer accepted versus, hey, I went to Walmart and bought a Binex test and tested myself and I'm submitting my results. I think those are two different categories. And you may want to just check for some clarification on that.
Thank you. Sheldon has a question that he fielded yesterday. If they have construction contractors on site, but they are cordoned off in a construction section that's off limit to public and students, do they have to vax?
I think that's where we had that discussion. And from my perspective, I mean, I think as long as they're cordoned off, they're not interacting with students. I do think that, hey, practically we can allow them to complete their jobs. The flip of that argument though is, okay, well, if we require them to provide vaccination status or testing notification of testing records, are we going to say like, okay, well, then don't do the work if you're not going to provide that information to us. So just my own view, I think practically try and put yourself in a position where, yeah, they're cordoned off and hey, if they can provide you with vaccination information, great. If not, I say, allow them to continue the work. Chelsea, thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's a tough issue. And I think it really does focus on those that are interacting with students where they're a contracted worker. So I think you want to work through it potentially on a case by case, like, are they working on a field and kids can come close to that field or, all these different considerations. So I think really case by case.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've covered, let's see, we've covered, okay, many districts keep vaccine verification record, may districts keep vaccination records, or can an employee show proof to HR and then keep vax status on file only without any other record retention?
Yes, I think both of those are valid options. You can take a picture of it or make a copy of it for your own records, or you can look at it. But I would suggest that if you have an employee looking at it, that they look at it, and actually attest that they have viewed it and, it met the requirements of the order.
Thank you. We've got about 5 more minutes. I'm going to keep plowing through these. Does testing happen on paid time? Do we pay our substitutes if we ask them to obtain weekly testing outside of their working hours?
I don't believe that there's any requirement that the testing has to occur during work hours. There's nothing in the order that suggests that. Now, I will say that at the end of the day, if you're building a case against an employee that is refusing to test, it is almost it's a little bit of a stronger argument to say, look, we've even provided this person with time off during the day to get tested, and yet they're still refusing to do so. I do think it makes it a stronger argument, but I mean, as far as the order goes, it's not saying, hey, this has to be done during work hours.
I would keep in mind that symptomatic testing has to be done during paid time or work hours under the Cal OSHA requirements. So we are distinguishing between the screening testing required under the order and the symptomatic testing required under Cal OSHA.
Thank you. We may have covered this, but does the LEA have to actually see the test results for each employee or volunteer, or just a verbal result?
You know, I would really want to see those records if I were in the LEA's position, because I'm the one who's required to track it under the order. And I just don't want to trust a verbal from everyone. I want to make sure that I've got it all in writing.
I agree with you. I mean, because I do think at the end of the day, unfortunately, we probably have to think in worst case scenarios. Hey, if there's an outbreak, what are our contact, tracing efforts? And if we don't have a solid way to say, hey, who's vaccinated and who's not, it could actually, spread. That old saying, trust but verify, like, okay, you've submitted to this test, you're negative, let me see the results. Right?
We're already documentation oriented, so keep it going, right?
Right.
We've got a question about whether a in-home kit, if the test is in-home, are those results acceptable?
I think if they're aligned with the school district's or county office's education's plan of acceptable tests, then I think they would be able to be used, as long as they have that emergency use authorization. I wouldn't see why they wouldn't be, but I would check in with your county public health officer to see whether or not those comply.
Yeah, because I think some of the issues are actually seeing the employee take the test, right? Ensuring that it's an employee that's doing it. Some of the testing, you actually have to do it, with someone watching you over Zoom. So it makes more sense that those would be acceptable versus the one where the employee is just doing it themselves at home. So I think you really need to look at the specific scenario that you're using in your district.
All right, we have an interesting question here. Since our unvaccinated employees are costing us money and time, can we give vaccinated employee an equitable stipend for getting it done?
I think you can. I mean, I think that there's an ability to do that. I mean, it's you look at stipends for other things with certificated employees. You always look at, hey, the uniform salary schedule requirement. This is an item that's not based on years of training or experience, right? It is vaccination status. So I think you can do that. I do think, though, that it has to be well thought out in the sense of, okay, the political issues at play. Are we going to be viewed as plain politics versus, hey, well, why not just allow these individuals to test? Chelsea, thoughts?
Well, I just want to make sure that you're doing this at the negotiations table, maybe as part of those impacts negotiations. Sure. And that we don't just have, a board announcing that they're going to give all vaccinated workers a stipend without having gone through that process.
Yeah, that's the irony of the collective bargaining statutes. You can't even give money away without negotiating it. So, yeah.
Is there any information we can get regarding ramifications against side effects of the vaccines, i.e. medical compensation for treatment of side effects?
Does that kind of sounds like, hey, if someone has side effects, they're not able to come to work. It kind of looks at it. I'm framing it that way, right? So I think SB 95 leave prior to September 30th. Other options is that, hey, I guess a district or county office could agree that, hey, if someone takes the vaccination after September 30th, we could provide some pay time off to recover for it.
Well, I think
think,
it's
Chelsea?
possible. I haven't seen this yet, but I think it would potentially be subject to the workers' compensation process if we told the employee, you know, they had to get the vaccine and then they had some severe reaction. Now, I haven't dealt with it because I haven't really seen any severe reactions like that yet. But, you know, I imagine there could be like the 1 in a million chance.
Sure. You know, for an employee that has a very, very adverse reaction, I mean, I would send them workers' compensation forms, but I'd also think about, you know, definitely if this occurred after September 30th, planning on maybe a day off after taking the second dose. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to finalize with one more question, which has probably 3 combined here. We're talking about the religious exemptions, the letter, you know, and who signs the letter. Are we required to collect medical or religious exemptions to the vaccine if the employee complies with weekly testing? And what about religious exemption for a mandatory vaccine? I think we covered that one. I'm sorry. We'll end on that one, and then we'll get answers to these last couple in here just to let everyone get on with their day.
So the first one was whether we have to collect the letter.
It's who signs it.
Oh, okay.
Are we required to collect a medical or religious exemption to the vaccine? I think you said yes. And who signs that verification letter on the religious exemption?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing some pastors sign some of these letters now. Really what we're looking at is the employee's sincerely held belief. So if we received a letter that was signed by someone who was not the employee, you know, as part of that sort of interactive light process that we talked about, I would sit down with the employee and, you know, ensure that this is their bona fide, sincerely held religious belief. And then if they verify that, I don't think it really matters, you know, whether someone else has signed that or not.
I would also just, again, preface this by saying that I don't believe a religious exemption would qualify, you know, for exempting an employee from a testing requirement. But I think what's most important is going through that process, right, of finding out, hey, we've engaged this employee, we've gathered information, and at the end of the day, we've made, you know, an attempt to try to accommodate them. You know, if it's, you know, I can't, you know, my religious beliefs won't let me, you know, put a swab in my nose. Well, okay, well, we have a saliva test. This is our accommodation for you. But if it's straight refusal, I do think then you're going to have to start looking at, okay, well, what are our options? Is it paid time, you know, unpaid time off? You know, a bunch of CBOs, I don't want to say paid time off in a room like this, right? But yeah, what are our options? Unpaid leave? Is it discipline? Yeah.
And I would suggest that even if they are complying, I would maintain those records in a confidential file, because I think that some of us may find down the road that, you know, these employees are challenging it, say, you never considered my sincerely held belief, you forced me to do this. And I think it's just part of documenting that process, that we did receive it, we engaged in this process, and then we required them to test anyway.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I know I said we had one question, but this one's a big one. It's coming up in states around us. Can a school district adopt a mandatory student vaccination requirement, or is this something that needs to be mandated by CDPH or the legislature?
I really think that is, you know, it's the question of the hour. And I think that we are going to see that be tested. So I think the question is, you know, generally it's the legislature that requires vaccination. So have they preempted the district's ability to do that is the question. And I think right now the law is not super clear, because, you know, the education code allows districts to undertake anything that isn't prohibited by the law. So we're weighing those two things together. And I actually believe that LAUSD has on its agenda today consideration of a mandatory vaccination policy. So I think we're going to probably see that play out in the courts, you know, really soon, and we'll have an answer to the question. So I think the real answer today is that it's the lawyerly answer of it's not clear right now. There are definitely arguments on both sides, and if you wanted to do it, we could make a legal argument for doing it.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, hey, it's the school district or county offices of education's decision to make. I do think you, like Chelsea rightly said, I mean, just be prepared for the challenges. You're going to want to have some good findings, some good support for why you're taking this action. You're going to have, some clearly identified exemptions, sort of preempt all of those issues that come forward. But yeah, be prepared for the medical and religious and the free public education arguments that come about. So I think a lot of it is, if you're going to go that route, make sure it's well planned, work with your legal counsel as to making the appropriate findings, and even lean on probably local public health for information and support for your findings for justifying such a policy.
All right. Wow. What an action-packed session. Thank you, Lozano Smith, for the
Thank you.
partnership. Thank you, Roman and Chelsea, for the wealth of information that you have. Like I said, there's so much gray area for us right now. So any of these tidbits of sort of black and white information are so helpful to us and our members. The session is recorded. It'll be on our website tomorrow. You'll see in our slides, obviously, contact for Lozano Smith. And if you have any additional questions, please reach out to me. We'll in turn reach out to our partners and get this information, these questions answered for you. And to our members, thanks for joining us today. And thank you for all that you are doing in this environment to support our students' success. We really appreciate you, and we'll see you on our next WorkWise webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Goodbye, everyone. Bye. Thank you again. Really appreciate it.